Have you ever watched someone who seemed completely indifferent suddenly transform into a desperate competitor the moment they realized what they might lose? Picture this: the person who barely returned your texts, who made plans with the enthusiasm of scheduling a dental appointment, who treated your relationship like a casual hobby they could pick up or put down at will. Then something shifts. Word reaches them that another person has entered the picture, and suddenly this master of emotional distance becomes a different creature entirely. Their carefully constructed walls begin to crack, revealing something raw and primal underneath. This phenomenon, this sudden awakening of panic in those with avoidant attachment styles when faced with competition, reveals one of the most fascinating contradictions of human psychology. Why avoidants panic when you date someone else becomes crystal clear when we understand the intricate dance between their deepest fears and their most compelling desires. These individuals who have spent years perfecting the art of emotional self-preservation find themselves caught in a psychological trap of their own making. They want connection but fear vulnerability. They crave intimacy but despise dependence. They've convinced themselves that caring less makes them stronger, yet when faced with genuine loss, their carefully maintained facade crumbles like ancient parchment. The psychology behind this transformation involves two powerful cognitive forces that shape human behavior in ways most people never recognize. Social comparison bias drives us to constantly measure our worth and desirability against others, while loss aversion makes potential losses feel twice as painful as equivalent gains feel pleasurable. When these forces collide in the mind of someone who has built their entire emotional strategy around avoiding vulnerability, the results can be explosive. Understanding this dynamic matters because it reveals something profound about human nature and attachment. Whether you're trying to comprehend your own reactions to competition, decode the bewildering behavior of someone who suddenly changed their tune when you started dating others, or simply gain insight into the complex world of avoidant attachment, this exploration will illuminate the hidden mechanisms that drive some of our most confusing relationship behaviors. The person who seemed immune to jealousy, who appeared to take your presence for granted, who acted as though they could easily replace you, suddenly reveals that beneath their cool exterior lies a deeply vulnerable human being who has simply learned to hide their needs behind walls of apparent indifference. Consider the story of a successful marketing executive who had mastered the art of keeping people at arm's length. This person had a pattern that repeated with clockwork precision across every romantic encounter. Initial charm would draw someone in, but as emotional intimacy beckoned, distance would follow. Responses to texts became delayed and minimal. Weekend plans turned into vague suggestions that never materialized. Phone calls dwindled to sporadic check-ins that felt more like duty than desire. The message was clear: care less, expect nothing, and you won't be disappointed. For months, this pattern held steady with someone special who had entered their life. Despite genuine connection and obvious compatibility, the familiar walls went up. Dates happened, but never too frequently. Conversations remained surface level, deflecting any attempt to dig deeper. The other person's increasing emotional investment was met with increasing emotional withdrawal, like two people walking in opposite directions on a moving walkway. Then something unexpected happened. The other person, tired of chasing someone who seemed perpetually out of reach, began dating someone new, not as revenge or manipulation, but as a genuine attempt to find the emotional availability that seemed impossible to access in their avoidant partner. Word of this new development reached the marketing executive through mutual friends, delivered as casual gossip over drinks after work. The reaction was immediate and shocking. The person who had spent months cultivating indifference suddenly felt as though the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Sleep became elusive. consumed by mental images of their former interest, laughing with someone else, sharing the kind of intimate moments they had always kept at bay. The rational mind insisted this reaction made no sense. After all, hadn't they been the one maintaining distance? Hadn't they communicated through their actions that this relationship wasn't a priority? Yet logic proved powerless against the tsunami of unexpected emotion that followed. Like Serena van der Woodsen from Gossip Girl discovering that Dan Humphrey had moved on, the secure world of having options while avoiding commitment suddenly crumbled. The comfortable position of being desired without having to reciprocate fully vanished overnight. What had seemed like emotional strength revealed itself as elaborate self-deception. The person who had convinced themselves they didn't need anyone discovered they had simply been taking someone's availability for granted. Understanding why this transformation occurs requires examining the psychological mechanisms at work. Social comparison bias ensures that we constantly evaluate ourselves relative to others, and for someone with avoidant attachment, the presence of competition triggers a fundamental threat to their sense of desirability and worth. They had unconsciously relied on being chosen, despite their emotional unavailability, as proof of their inherent value. When that choice was withdrawn and offered to someone else, the comparison became devastatingly clear. They were being measured against another person and found wanting. Loss aversion compounds this reaction by making the potential loss feel exponentially more painful than the relationship had felt pleasurable. The casual connection they had taken for granted suddenly became precious when threatened with disappearance. This isn't about love or genuine attachment in the healthy sense, but about the psychological pain of losing something that had been unconsciously categorized as theirs, regardless of how little effort they had invested in maintaining it. The first step in addressing avoidant panic when faced with competition involves recognizing these reactions for what they truly are: psychological defense mechanisms being triggered, not genuine romantic awakening. When someone with avoidant attachment suddenly becomes intensely interested after learning about competition, they're responding to threat, not love. Understanding this distinction is crucial because actions taken from a place of panic rarely lead to sustainable emotional growth or healthy relationship dynamics. The immediate impulse will be to compete, to suddenly become the attentive, available partner they had previously refused to be. This reaction feels urgent and necessary, driven by the primitive part of the brain that responds to perceived threats with fight or flight responses. However, this sudden shift in behavior, while dramatic, often represents performance rather than genuine change. It's like Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You, suddenly realizing that his object of obsession might slip away, triggering desperate measures that have more to do with possession than authentic connection. Instead of acting on these panic-driven impulses, the more productive approach involves sitting with the discomfort and examining what it reveals about underlying attachment patterns. The panic serves as a valuable diagnostic tool, highlighting areas where growth is needed. Why does the threat of loss feel so devastating when the actual relationship had been treated with such casualness? What does this reaction reveal about how love and control have become entangled in unconscious ways? True healing begins with acknowledging that the intense feelings triggered by competition are not the same as genuine romantic love or healthy attachment. They represent the activation of primitive survival mechanisms that perceive relationship threats as existential dangers. Someone experiencing this panic needs to resist the urge to immediately act on these feelings and instead use them as an opportunity for self-reflection and growth. The next crucial step involves learning to differentiate between wanting someone because they're pulling away and wanting someone because of genuine compatibility and connection. Avoidant individuals often confuse the excitement of the chase with romantic love, mistaking anxiety and uncertainty for passion. When someone else enters the picture, it artificially recreates the dynamic of uncertainty that their nervous system has learned to associate with attraction. Developing genuine emotional availability requires consistent practice in small, manageable doses rather than dramatic gestures triggered by competition. This means learning to stay present during moments of intimacy instead of automatically creating distance. It involves sharing vulnerable thoughts and feelings even when everything inside screams to retreat. Most importantly, it requires building tolerance for the discomfort that comes with genuine emotional risk. Working through these patterns often benefits from professional support, particularly from therapists who specialize in attachment theory. The deeply ingrained nature of avoidant patterns means they rarely shift through willpower alone. These behavioral strategies developed as necessary survival mechanisms, often in childhood environments where emotional needs were consistently unmet or punished. Changing them requires patience, compassion, and often professional guidance to navigate the complex emotions that arise when old defenses begin to soften. For those on the receiving end of this dynamic, understanding avoidant panic can provide valuable insight, but it shouldn't become a reason to accept inconsistent treatment or emotional unavailability. Someone who only shows genuine interest when faced with competition is revealing important information about their capacity for relationship. Like Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris choosing between Gabriel and Alfie, the decision shouldn't be based on who wants you most intensely in moments of panic, but on who can offer consistent emotional presence and genuine partnership. The journey toward healthier attachment patterns is neither quick nor linear. It involves repeatedly choosing vulnerability over safety, presence over distance, and genuine connection over the artificial excitement of uncertainty. Each small step builds capacity for the kind of intimate relationship that avoidant individuals both crave and fear. The panic triggered by competition can serve as a wake-up call, but lasting change requires sustained effort long after the immediate threat has passed. Understanding why avoidants panic when you date someone else illuminates the complex interplay between our deepest fears and desires. Social comparison bias and loss aversion combine to create perfect storms of emotional reactivity in people who have spent years learning to suppress their attachment needs. The person who seemed immune to jealousy reveals themselves to be profoundly human, struggling with the same fundamental needs for connection and significance that drive us all. The path forward requires courage to face these uncomfortable truths about attachment patterns and the commitment to do the difficult work of change. For those experiencing avoidant panic, this represents an opportunity to develop genuine emotional availability rather than the conditional interest that only appears when threatened with loss. For those witnessing this transformation in others, it offers insight into the complex psychology behind seemingly contradictory behaviors. Real change begins with recognizing that panic-driven attention, while intense and flattering, differs fundamentally from the steady, consistent care that characterizes healthy relationships. The goal isn't to trigger more dramatic reactions or to settle for scraps of attention doled out only when competition appears. Instead, the aim should be developing the capacity for sustained emotional presence that doesn't require external threats to activate. Take time to examine your own patterns around competition and loss. Notice when your interest in someone intensifies primarily because they're pulling away or seeing others. Pay attention to whether your most passionate feelings arise from genuine connection or from the activation of competitive instincts. Use these observations not for self-judgment, but as valuable information about areas where growth and healing might be needed. The human heart's capacity for love and connection far exceeds our ability to protect ourselves from its risks. Those who have learned to love conditionally, who offer their best selves only when threatened with loss, carry within them the same potential for deep, authentic relationship that exists in everyone. The panic that arises when faced with competition can become the catalyst for profound personal transformation, but only when met with honest self-reflection rather than desperate attempts to win back what was never fully offered in the first place.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.